Today's guest has just appeared on ABC's Four Corners episode, Collision, which laid out some uncomfortable truths about concussion, CTE, and the AFL. Professor Alan Pearce is a clinical neurophysiologist whose work focuses on sports-related concussion and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, using non-invasive brain stimulation to track how the brain changes over time in footballers, rugby players, and other contact athletes. In this episode, we talk about what concussion really is, why the brain can still be impaired long after symptoms settle, and what his research says about return to play guidelines that clear players after 12 or 14 symptom-free days. We also get into CTE, how many concussions might be too many, and the cultural forces that keep players saying just one more, even as the risks mount. So you started in clinical neurophysiology. At what point did concussion become your main focus, and what was it about the problem that really kept your attention?
Just very quickly going back to when I sort of started doing my PhD over in Perth, I was actually helping out a postdoctoral fellow at the time, looking at how the brain recovered after stroke. And look, back in those days, the term neuroplasticity hadn't really become, ubiquitous as it is today, but it was certainly something that we were interested in, even though we didn't, sort of know what we were looking at. And we had this technique, which I still use in my research today, helping us understand, the physiological changes in the brain as someone sort of recovered after a stroke. And that sort of picked up my interest in brain injury. So I've always had an interest in brain injury, but after I finished my PhD and came across to Melbourne, it was very hard to sort of find, work in that area. And so it took a long time before I was able to sort of start getting into, particularly with brain injury and the neuroplastic changes with that. But and that was at Epworth Hospital. But unfortunately, the work was a little bit hodgepodge, and we didn't get too far. So I got a new job at a university where one of the PhD students was playing football, and this is around 2011 now, and said, have you considered concussion? Because that's something that we're worried about in football. And I said, well, absolutely, because I had heard of this strange disease coming out of America called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and I was sort of thought, might sort of look into this. And so that really started my journey into both concussion and CTE, because one of my first studies was actually looking at retired Australian rules football players, both former professional AFL players and club players, playing Australian rules football. So, from about 2011, this has been my thing for every day, literally.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been that length of time, and obviously there's still so much unknown about it all. Was there a particular point along in that journey where you sort of realised it wasn't just a sports medicine issue, and there was much bigger public health and cultural issue tied in with it? Yeah,
it was actually pretty quick, because I was sort of probably about 6 months into my first study in these football players, and the person that was helping me out with recruitment was a former player manager, and he loves media, and so he, I guess in some respects, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but I was ambushed by media interest in what I was doing, and because of that, I started getting inquiries from ex-military, police, and domestic violence. So this is and as well as workplace accidents, car accidents where people weren't recovering, told they were going to recover but never did. So for me, it was this sort of complete explosion of an area that I guess was hiding in plain sight. So everyone was obviously aware of concussion, but no one was really I guess, fully appreciative of how significant an injury it can be and also how widespread it is.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I think that well, that sounds like you got thrown in the deep end quite
Yeah,
literally with all that stuff.
yeah.
Well, going into the actual what physically is happening, starting with concussion.
Sure.
When a person or sports player is concussed, what is actually happening in the brain beyond sort of the way that most people just think about it?
Yeah, look, we've got to consider, well, firstly, concussion's a brain injury. I always use this as my first soapbox to tell people to try and not use the words head knock. It's certainly more than a head knock. It is a traumatic brain injury, a mild traumatic brain injury, but it's quite significant nevertheless. And what we are sort of seeing with a concussion is the fact that it's a disruption of the brain's electrical activity after a impact directly or indirectly to the head. And so, some of the myths around concussion is that, people think that you need to be knocked out, and that only happens in about 10% of all cases. People think that concussion is just, a transient injury that will recover within a few minutes or a couple of days, and we know that it takes much longer than that. But essentially it's a disruption of the brain's cells to communicate with each other, and that's why you see all the signs and symptoms of confusion, dizziness, nausea, headaches, vomiting, slurring of speech. There's a whole constellation of signs and symptoms that I always forget every one of them because there's just so many. But people are even getting agitated, irritated, and some will start crying spontaneously for no reason. I get a lot of people saying, "I just started crying. I didn't know why." So there's a whole bunch of and you only need to have one of those, signs and or symptoms after a observable collision, particularly in sport, but obviously after a fall or a car accident as well. Because a lot of these signs and symptoms do overlap with other conditions as well. So someone could faint, and we could confuse it with concussion. So there has to be a known event for these signs and symptoms to come on. But essentially what we're seeing is a disruption of brain activity.
Now, one of the most interesting parts when I was researching some of your work that you were looking at is that gap between sort of symptom resolution and the physiological recovery after a concussion. What did you find with that research, and what does it matter?
Well, I guess, I have been sort of focusing in on the sport aspect of concussion. And so I looked very briefly after I finished my the first study on the return to play, there was an opportunity to, look at concussion, I guess, from an acute perspective. So, because for me it was like, well, why are we having these long-term concerns and what is happening in the acute space? So I was fortunate enough to be able to get a Victorian Amateur Football Association team, Hampton Rovers, in the VAFA, and we wanted to have a look and see what happens using the technique that I use, which is brain stimulation, to be able to look at the physiology of the brain after concussion. And I was very sort of interested to see what the timeline was because, reading the consensus statements, the consensus was that, within about 7 to 10 days, people mostly recover and everything's fine. And I wasn't quite so sure about that because a lot of the stories I was being told by the footballers were, I still went to play the following week and I wasn't quite right. What we did was we looked at, cognitive changes and, signs and symptoms, and did my brain stimulation to compare the physiology with the clinical measures, as so to speak. And what I found in that preliminary study was that at the time, because the consensus was, within 7 to 10 days, we could only take the university I was working at would only give me ethics to take me to like 2 weeks after a concussion. But it became very apparent that, by 10 days, the brain hadn't fully recovered, even though the cognitive testing, which involved, reaction time and a little bit of working memory and things like that, were resolving within that time period. There was something happening in the brain that just wasn't fully recovering. And so that was my sort of first foray into understanding that I think our expectations of players playing the following week is too high. And around the same time, there was research starting to come out from the UK saying that concussed players were at sort of, 2.5-fold risk of further injury, and that's a musculoskeletal injury, let alone a concussion. And so for me, it was like, well, hang on a moment. If we're seeing risk in injury, maybe it's because the neuromuscular pathways were not resolving as by the time that they're going back out to play. So from about 2015, I started advocating for longer recovery periods, which obviously fell on deaf ears and went down like a lead balloon for a number of years. Until, I guess, 2021, when the Australian Football League brought in their mandated 12-day rest period. And that was quite interesting too, because just prior to that, in trying to, I guess, understand this, return to play issue, one of the studies I published just sort of at the same time was showing that the return to play between the concussion and the doctor's clearance of a player, and this is in the AFL, was increasing from 2017, which sort of started off at about 11 and a half days. 2018 got up to about 15, 16 days. 2019 it got up to nearly 19 days because of the more conservative nature of the return to play process, which I thought was quite encouraging. But in 2020, and I don't know if most people won't remember this, but in 2020, the AFL quietly introduced a new policy where they wanted the doctor to give 5 days notice before a player returned to play. And without testing the idea, the AFL just said, well, this will extend the period of time for a player to return to play. And it's quite interesting because in 2020, because of that 5 days, the doctors were actually, not necessarily themselves, but maybe they were pressured, we don't know, but the time period went back from 19 days to 11 and a half days. So it actually went backwards based on that policy. And this is where the AFL brought out their 12-day mandated policy because of that. So it was kind of interesting that, everyone started saying, okay, 12 days is the day. In 2023, I was able to finally get a follow-up study to the Hampton Rovers, where I looked at, I was able to get Seaford Football Club, who are playing in the Southeastern or Mornington Peninsula League. And I also got the Melbourne ice hockey team as well. So it was kind of good. I could do a full extended study. And basically what I found was that, while symptoms and cognitive tests were resolving around that 12-day period, it took 26 days for the brain to fully recover. And so there's this complete window of mismatch between a player being cleared to return to play after 12 days or in a club league 21 days, and the fact that the brain was still not quite resolving. And so, this is the concern that I have, is not so much around the diagnosis of concussion by the field of play, even though everyone seems to be obsessed in that area. The concern that I have is the fact that we've got to have better return to play management and know that a player is fully recovered, rather than just sort of sending them back because the guidelines say it's okay to do so.
Yeah, well, I had no idea it was that length of time it took. Did you research, was there a big variance in individuals? Like, did some people take 40 days and some people were quicker, or was it around that average was pretty?
Oh, look, it was still individual, and I think that sort of talks to where we probably would need to have biomarkers to give us a better indication of when a player is fit to return to play, because there were some players that were sort of recovering, because I did it sort of the way I structured the data collection was 2, 12, 19, 26. So some were recovered at 19 days, some at 26 still weren't yet recovered, but I couldn't collect any more data after that. So, it is still it's still varied, but the fact that there was this sort of disparity between symptom resolution and brain recovery was for me the key indicator here.
Yeah, definitely. So where does the 14-day post-symptom sort of guideline come from? Because I know a lot of juniors and other sort of more amateur stuff. That's the guidelines they follow.
I'm not sure which one you're talking about there.
I've heard they sort of say symptom-free for 14 days. I've heard that.
Yeah, so that's part of the Australian Sports Commission's 21-day protocol.
Right.
So they need to be symptom-free for 14 days before they can be cleared at 21 days.
Okay, right.
It's 14 days that they've got to be symptom-free. If they're still symptomatic for the first 5 days, then they've still got to be 14 days asymptomatic, which is good. But again, my argument is that parents, players, kids will say, "Well, I'm fine. I don't have any symptoms." While crossing their fingers behind their back. And we've seen this with the research that, particularly at the elite level, but the AFL Players Association reported probably, it's increased now, but it's about 12 to 15% of all their players hide their symptoms from doctors. There were some alarming reports in the NRL. 60% of their players were hiding symptoms in training. This is the issue around having a subjective criteria on testing, and I guess I'm showing my bias a bit, but as a physiologist, I want to see physiological measures, not just they've got to complement the clinical measures as well, and we've been relying too long on just a subjective measure and players sort of providing a response.
Yeah, definitely. Now, then moving on to CTE, can you, as best as we currently understand it today, what exactly is it?
Yeah, CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or encephalopathy, wherever you come from. So it's a neurodegenerative brain disease. So it's, think of it like a dementia. But it does differ to other dementias like Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia, and we have other neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and motor neuron disease as well. So it's sort of in that family of brain degenerative diseases. Now, CTE, similar to Alzheimer's, I guess, core is sort of progresses because of this protein called tau, T-A-U. And tau is it's actually really important in the brain for the structural integrity of each brain cell or neuron. But the problem is that when tau is released into the environment or the extracellular space, it becomes quite toxic to neurons. Now, in Alzheimer's and other dementias, we don't really know why that tau is released. It's age and possibly genetic family factors, things like that. But it does happen organically. But with CTE, we know that it happens due to physical trauma to the brain. And the reason for that are twofold. One is that it starts in a different part of the brain than Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is in the very deep parts of the brain. CTE starts in the outer part of the brain, very specifically at and obviously you've got the lumps and bumps of the brain when you see it, and the top parts of the gyrus and the bottom parts of the sulci. And so CTE is very much defined pathologically at the depths of the cortical sulci around a perivascular space, so around a blood vessel basically, and it clumps. So Alzheimer's, when it does spread, it becomes very uniform, this tau. But with CTE, it's very clumpy, and it's very much sort of centered around that bottom of the sulci until it starts to spread. And the reason for that is, if you think about the brain when it's getting physically hit, it's moving. And it's not just moving, but it's twisting and turning. But if you think about the brain in the skull, the gyri is actually tethered to the membrane called the meninges. But the sulci isn't. And so it acts like a pendulum. So when you think about a movement, it's almost like a pendulum-like effect, which then releases the tau. And so this is the biomechanical basis for CTE starting. And so as it starts to spread, it affects various aspects of behaviour, cognitive impairments, not just memory. Memory is very obviously a characteristic for Alzheimer's, but for CTE, there's impulsivity, problems with executive decision making, planning. Where a lot of people go, I walk into a place and I don't know why I'm here, and I get overwhelmed and I can't deal with this. So the symptoms actually are different over a period of time, and the other thing too with CTE is that it's not just an old person's disease. In Australia, the youngest that we have found CTE is 20 years of age. And, more recently, we've just, sort of announced that a 23-year-old has had CTE, and we've got a number of cases in their 20s. In the United States, it's as young as 17, and in the UK, as young as 15. So this is not at all what you would expect when you're sort of getting to later in life and you're kind of getting dementia, and people are kind of expecting that. This is something that happens at all ages, and it's happening not just at professional athletes but also in club level athletes as well. So it's because of the repetitive nature of the impacts, rather than the one big hit every now and then.
So yeah, you've been quite clear with the messaging that CTE isn't simply a concussion issue.
No.
So yeah, what do you mean exactly by that then?
Yeah, so it's a disease risk of exposure, and so what we've found, here at the Australian Sports Brain Bank, but also internationally, is the fact that the number of concussions has no impact or influence over whether the person has got CTE or the severity of it. What we do find is that the more hits, and I guess the more harder hits that are not concussive in nature, is increasing the risk. And so what we find is that those who play contact sports for a long period of time, particularly if they do play at high levels as well, are at more risk. So most of the data that we've seen so far, kids who start playing full contact at 7 or 8 years of age, play right through until they're 30, 35 years of age, they are really at the greatest risk. And they could be experiencing, tens of thousands of hits over their sporting career. So that's for us is the real concern. In America, they've obviously got more. I guess they're more. What's the word? They've been doing the work for longer than us, and they've also had the opportunity of correlating sensor data in the helmets of American footballers to the pathology data in the brain banks. And so in 2023, Boston University published quite a seminal paper on correlating the number of hits versus and what position in a team in American football was showing the risk of CTE and the severity of it. So a quarterback, for example, if they played from, so basically from high school through to NFL level, they were increasing their risk from 1.5 to fourfold risk of getting CTE the longer they played. But a defensive linesman who was just constantly, doing smash, that their risk was 109-fold. So essentially every defensive linesman who played up to NFL level was going to get CTE.
Oh.
Yeah.
Jeez.
So, this is something that, we've got to explore here in Australia with Australian rules football, rugby league, rugby union, and soccer as well. We just have to find out because we just don't know.
Yeah, it sounds like, that's purely from just the data. It's pretty amazing what they're coming up with.
Yes,
but right. When you think about it more on a human level, it's quite shocking as well at the same time.
And that's it, absolutely, because, a lot of families don't even know what CTE is. And so, all of a sudden their dad or their brother or their son just starts to, change erratically in their behaviour, and no one knows why. They get misdiagnosed, they get the wrong treatments, which can then make things worse. And so this is why the research is so important, because we just have to letting people know so that they're aware not to stop the sports or change the sports in any significant way, but let's just look at ways that we can make this safer, because it is actually, unlike Alzheimer's, CTE is entirely preventable.
Yeah, I was I was actually speaking with my wife about it the other night after watching the Four Corners episode, and I found it hard to verbalize what I was thinking, but it was along the lines of the, informed consent about knowing the risks is a tricky one with this type of condition, because it's a lot of people, especially probably more so men, generalizing, but that risk is down the road. It sort of doesn't seem as front and center because you're dealing with it later in life, and it's a hard one to actually get the person to buy in and knowing that I should probably not be doing this because of the drastic risk to my health in the future. Yeah.
Well, this is it. And this is what makes it so difficult, because we see sport as being a healthy activity, for the body as well as the mind. There's all these benefits of playing sport, absolutely. But what a lot of us are concerned about is the fact that the risks aren't necessarily being communicated enough so that people can make an informed decision. And I guess the other part too is, when we talk about sports, there's a whole bunch of non-contact sports that offer exactly the same benefit. And when it's kind of interesting because, people are sort of saying, well, we can't, we've got to get our kids playing these sports. If they're not going to get the full benefits. And it's kind of interesting because I say, well, or they elevate contact sport athletes, football as being, the best athletes. And I'm saying, well, so obviously you don't consider Roger Federer an athlete then. And they're like, oh, well, no, we're not saying that. Well, I'm saying the counter argument is, well, because you don't play a contact sport, you're less of an athlete. I really sort of wonder when you think about, the people at Wimbledon right now, what they would say to that. So there are alternatives, and it's not just, being accused of being anti-sport, but rather being pro-athlete.
Yeah, well, pro health.
Pro health, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That it shows, I guess, the cultural bias that a lot of in Australia, but obviously in big chunks of America and all over the world with that contact side of things, it's sort of baked in, which is going to be a hard ship to steer.
Pretty much. Yeah, that's right.
So leading in from that a little bit with I imagine it's almost impossible at the moment to tell, but do we know the threshold at all? Like how many, of those, head trauma, subconcussive sort of things is a higher risk factor, or is it just too hard to know?
Look, based upon the work from America at the moment, it kind of looks like for every 1,000 hits, you increase your risk by about 20%. So that's something that we've got to consider here, and this is why if we can reduce the exposure through contact training limits, modifying sport for kids. That reduces the risk quite significantly.
Yeah, it's the more I hear you speak, the more I'm glad I gave footy up when I was only about 20 rather than carrying on. Which
and that's kind of interesting because in America they've got their college-based system. So, if you don't make it to the professional leagues, that's kind of the end of your career. But in Australia, we have the club-based system. So it's when footballers in particular finish their AFL career, they go back to their local clubs and continue playing. So
sometimes for another 10, 15 years.
That's right. So and for me that was one of the first indicators that we've got possibly a bigger issue here, because when I did that study in 2014, I found no difference in the impairments of the club players versus the former, AFL/VFL players that were involved, because, the exposure, and at that time I really wasn't sort of understanding exposure risk. I was just looking at concussion as the primary variable. But, as time went on, this sort of became clearer and clearer that, these longer careers can actually do more damage.
Is there much work known about the genetic side of things in terms?
It's slowly. That's one of the areas that we are desperately trying to fund research here in Australia at the Brain Bank. We need to understand the genetic risks, or sorry, I wouldn't say genetic risks, but the genes that might create the greatest risk for CTE. We know that the ApoE4 gene is particularly one that has been identified in boxers, and also for Alzheimer's risk as well. But it hasn't been as strong in footballers where there is incidental hitting versus combat sports where the objective is basically to give your opponent a brain injury. There are some other markers that are being explored at the moment, but it's sort of way back here at the moment, which is frustrating because there may well be, and I think some have argued that should we be doing genetic testing because you can unfairly not select a junior player for a professional career based upon their genetic risk profile. And so, there's that whole ethical aspect around it too. So, that's something that we're probably going to have to come across that bridge when we get to it.
Yeah, it becomes quite a sort of murky conversation then, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's right.
Preventative, obviously, number one thing is just avoiding completely.
Yeah.
But even when I was, a junior playing, you'd sort of see people or kids, and even some of the AFL players, but wearing helmets as a preventative, and people thinking that that's great, there's some protection there that's going to prevent me. But I know I've heard that there really isn't much research to back that up, and if anything can sort of skew that they might be a little bit more risk averse, or if they're a bit less risk averse. Sorry,
risk compensation. Yep. Look, we've had. I'm trying to do the math in my head right now. 35, nearly 40 years of helmet research, both hard shell, soft shell, hard shell with a cap, soft shell with different designs, and there has been no protection for the brain. So, this is for both concussion mitigation as well as, CTE. So, what helmets do is they protect the skull from fractures and lacerations. And I've said this multiple times, but I'm a cyclist. I will wear a helmet irrespective of the laws because I know it's going to protect my skull from a fracture if I come off the bike, which I do. I can get a bit silly sometimes, So, but it doesn't stop the brain tissue from moving inside the skull. And we can never say never, but helmets don't offer enough force absorption to stop the brain tissue from moving. And part of the concern I have around this is the fact that there's a lot of engineers and tech people who are thinking about this and do some incredibly amazing engineering designs, but we're constantly forgetting about the anatomy of the brain. And the anatomy of the brain is, the tissue is like silken tofu. So when we talk about, and a lot of people are really quite surprised to hear that, because when they think about the brain, they think about, biology class where they did the dissection in high school, or those who go to the butcher and they get a brain for, dinner or something like that, lamb's brains. That's a fixed brain. So you can slice through it. And that's the sort of stuff that we have to do when we analyse the brain for CTE. We have to fix the brain, because a non-fixed brain will slide through your fingers. And particularly, if you think about a brain, it weighs between, 1.3, 1.5 kilos. And if you had a silken tofu weighing 1.3 to 1.5 kilos, it would just collapse in on itself. That's how delicate it is. So it doesn't take much for that sort of material to move, and the brain tissue will move. And it's that constant moving that we don't want, because again, people have this misconception that the brain is sort of hitting the skull and going back and all this sort of stuff. And yeah, there's a little bit of that, but it's more the stretching and the shearing that occurs that releases the tau and causes the toxicity to the brain. And so this is where helmets just doesn't have enough protection to stop that brain from moving.
Now, as I mentioned before about you appeared on the latest Four Corners episode about CTE. So that hopefully is going to make some changes. Fingers crossed. What do you hope that program actually makes clear?
I think leading up to the Four Corners program, we've had a lot of media around this issue. Mostly around concussion, not enough on CTE. So that was the first thing, that the Four Corners program really focused in on CTE, and I think a lot of people were quite shocked about CTE, what it is, why most people haven't heard about it, and how it's being completely ignored from a scientific perspective in terms of research funding. That we're just not progressing anywhere near enough, and at catastrophic consequences to a lot of families whose kids and parents and brothers and sisters have played these sports. The other thing too is that for Four Corners, it was for 45 to 50 minutes was able to really address an issue, because again, prior to that, a lot of media were like 3-minute snippet reports. And so people are just getting a little bit here, a little bit there, a case study here, case study there. And no one was able to really put anything together. And so I'm hoping that the Four Corners program will able to sort of bring it all together for people to go, right, this is something that we've got to address, because, we're seeing the evidence at the brain bank. We're seeing the lived experience of Matty Robbins, ex-AFL player. We're seeing, what happens when families are sort of left wondering what happened to their son, and only to find out that they had a disease that they had never even heard of. And a lot of other families will be going, could that be our situation as well? So, that's what I hope that the Four Corners will help change that conversation, and more importantly, galvanise funded research into CTE specifically, and not just continue down the same path of concussion detection, concussion detection, concussion detection.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I can only say from my perspective, but it was incredibly powerful, the way that they sort of tied in that, literally the emotional side of things, which is, it makes you just really heartbroken for all these people and their families that are going through it.
Yes. That's right.
You would have gotten a bit of feedback already. What's the feedback been from the first few days?
Look, it's been all sort of very supportive, and it ranges from, I can't believe that we never heard of this disease before, through to I'm so angry that there's nothing being done about this, to we couldn't stop crying through the whole episode or the whole report. This is devastating. And so that's sort of, even from other colleagues like Michael at the Brain Bank, and even Jess Haller, the journalist, I don't think anyone has come back saying, "Oh, look, you've sensationalised this. This is not." There was nothing really negative there. So I think if there was going to be anything negative, it seemed to be against the AFL for lack of inaction.
Yep, perfect segue, because I'm sure I'm not alone, but the thing that stood out quote-wise was from Laura Kane, as you would be aware of that. Not to communicate. Their job is not to communicate every single aspect that exists in our game.
Yeah.
What do you make of that line?
Well, yes, it's really quite stunning in that admission, and when you think about risk. And particularly in the AFL as well, all those players are employees of the AFL, even though they're sort of drafted to their clubs and all that. It's all part of the AFL. There are no franchise clubs like in NRL or in American football or soccer. All these clubs are essentially owned by the AFL, and so they're all employees. And so, as a colleague said to me, McDonald's doesn't, let any risk go non-communicated. Even right down to their coffee cups that says, hot, liquid, care, risk, that sort of stuff. So that most people just didn't buy that. Particularly for something as serious as brain injury, there has to be communication of risk, and so, a lot of players in my research program said, look, we expected broken bones, torn muscles, ACLs, ruptured Achilles, dislocated shoulders, but no one said that we were at risk of dementia. And I guess, on the flip side was that a lot of them were told that they wouldn't get dementia. And we've got too many that are struggling cognitively and also with suspected CTE for it to not be communicated. And so we kind of all were quite gobsmacked with that. Quote.
Yes. Yeah, well, when you list all those different risks of injuries, I think I would put that right at the very top of risk of literally ending your life, essentially.
We've known since 1928 that in the modern sense, 1928 was the first sort of evidence that's coming out about repetitive impacts has real consequences to the brain. And the paper was called Punch Drunk, and that's where we get the term punch drunk from. So it's not like we haven't really known what the argument against it is that, we knew about it in combat sports, but we don't really knew about it in contact sports. Again, I've got colleagues who are medical historians who say, well, we actually just, one of them, Stephen Townsend, and I published in The Conversation the day after the Four Corners program. Stephen put in there that Australian medical doctors were concerned about repetitive impacts to the head as far back as 1936. So, it's going to be difficult for people to say, well, we never really knew about it. Well, it was hiding in plain sight.
is that resistance not just, sort of closing your eyes and avoiding it, but do you think it comes down to just the business side of things and the detriment it can have from, literally dollars sort of value?
Yeah, look, that's a good question, because at the end of the day, the AFL, NRL, NFL, FIFA, National Hockey League, whatever, World Rugby, they're in the business of sport entertainment. And so it's in their best interest to have the big stars out there as much as possible, because they can pump it up and, get the television rights and sell the tickets and create all this sort of microeconomy around it. And so I always find it really quite interesting that that a lot of these sports want to get involved in, medical and scientific research as well, rather than leaving that to, scientific and medical research institutes and universities to do the work where the expertise should be, not get people to come and work in a sport entertainment business to show that, there's nothing wrong here. So, that brings in the whole conflict of interest concerns that are being sort of, thrown around the place. And so, it does boil down, because the sports really need to get people into their sport as early as possible in their life, for them to become essentially lifelong consumers of the sporting product. And so, it's not just, it's very little to do with long-term athlete development, and more of, let's get them into our brand, and we'll have them for the next 50 years buying tickets, paying, television subscriptions, buying merchandise, and the rest.
Especially when the AFL outwardly, one of the goals is to cross that 1 million person player.
That's right.
Yeah,
because that's essentially revenue raising.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, if you had a parent that asked you whether or not they should let their child play a contact sport, rather than just saying no, what would you want them to understand before making that decision?
Yeah, so I guess, at the moment there is still contact in junior sports. What we're, advocating for is to have modified versions of these sports to non-contact until the age of 14. And we're still sort of, working on that. But in the meantime, things that I would recommend or advise parents is, is it possible for them to put their kids into a non-contact version of those sports? So touch rugby, AFL 9s, that still gets the kids to enjoy the sport, but more importantly, they learn a lot of fundamental motor skills. So they learn how to kick, they learn how to catch or mark, they learn how to throw or handball, they learn psychological resilience skills of winning and losing, dealing with, difficult teammates or whatever. They get the socialisation that's good for brain health as well through, just being in a social activity, just minus the collisions that are affecting the brain. And so there are options right now. The other thing too is, if that's not negotiable and they want their kids to play contact sports, which I wouldn't recommend, but talk to the clubs on, what is their concussion policy? Do they have a concussion policy? Do they have a concussion coordinator who's watching the games to look out for that? Because, 99.9% of junior and club matches do not have a medical doctor present. They can't afford it. It just doesn't happen that way. And maybe some clubs will have a club member or a parent who happens to be a medical doctor and can give their time for free on those weekends. Great. But most clubs don't have that. They only have sports trainers that really shouldn't be. It's not fair on them to try and diagnose, or not, they can't diagnose, but to at least recognise and understand a complex neurological issue such as concussion. So is there a spotter? Do they have a protocol on bringing their child off, screening them for signs and symptoms, and maybe just a very brief oculomotor test for eye movement? Okay, we've got to get them to a hospital or a clinic that's open on weekends or whatever. So, do they have that? Does that club have that policy as well? And do they have an education program for players, coaches, and administrators as well? Because overseas, especially one of the concerns around junior sport is, and while it's rare, there's a risk of catastrophic injury known as second impact syndrome, and this is where a child or a young adolescent or even a young adult have a impact to the head. It's not recognised, or it's not sort of known. The player just gets up and runs on, or the player says I'm fine and goes back out and plays. They get a second impact to the head, and they can die within minutes because the brain just starts to swell. And so in America and in Canada, they now have laws stating that all clubs need to be doing mandatory concussion education yearly, like they do for first aid, but for all people involved in the sport. And in Scotland as well, they do have a very similar sort of outlook after a 14-year-old died on the rugby field. We've had examples here, most recently in Adelaide with Antonio Loya-Cano, who was a 23-year-old footballer and took a fairly significant impact in the first quarter, but got up and ran on. I think it was in the start of the third quarter, took another hit to the head and died on the field in his mother's arms because she was watching the game. And so, Wendy, his mother, is trying to lobby the South Australian government to do something similar in having mandatory, because the club just had no understanding of what was going on. So, these are the difficult conversations that we've got to have around this, and we're certainly not trying to scare anyone away from sport. We just want to make sure that kids are safe.
So that I heard that story, but I didn't know that was actually the reason that he passed away, which is incredible.
It was sort of spun into cardiac arrest.
That's what you're right.
And cardiac arrest is a sort of a secondary what happens after you get a brain injury. The heart can go into cardiac arrest, and so that's been the focus rather than the fact that he had a significant brain injury.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Jeez. Well, then I guess more into the obviously leading on from the junior side into when athletes, and doesn't have to be elite or sub-elite or anything, but how do you reckon they should think about getting to the point where the risk is no longer worth it, whether they've had a few head knocks or they just sort of think like what's that too many, or where should I stop?
Yeah, look, that's always an individual question, but because some need to stop after one, some might need to stop after 5 or 6. I would hopefully never hope that an athlete would get to 5 or 6 or 10 concussions before they actually consider it. But generally speaking, if someone is not recovering within the expected time frame of 3 to 4 weeks, and they're sort of getting into that persistent post-concussion symptom territory, then that's an indication that maybe they shouldn't be continuing to play these sports. And particularly if they're also getting, someone's getting maybe 2 or 3 concussions in one season, what that means is that there's obviously a lowering of the threshold before the symptoms come on after an impact to the head. And that again is an indicator that there's something not quite right. And obviously each time is taking a bit longer as well. Then the player should really consider not playing anymore, or playing a non-contact version, or getting involved in the sport in some other respect, because it's just too much of a risk. At the very least, it gives risk for cognitive impairments, but obviously at the more extreme end, it's concern for risk of early onset dementias, and even motor neuron disease and Parkinson's disease for that matter.
Okay. you hear that, and there was even one of the players in the Four Corners episode, and you hear it quite a bit of, they'll say, if I get one more, that will do me, but that probably is past the point of where, because they've obviously had a few to start with, so it seems like it's not a good principle to live by.
No, exactly, and then that again talks to the cultural aspect around this. As much as we have education, my argument is that education is only half the battle, because what players then can do is weaponize that education into how to get around these concussion testing. They get round, or have that sort of view that, oh look, just one more is like, I'll be okay. It's an injury that resolves. I can just do one more. Whereas the cultural aspect to it is, we've got to look after our brain health, just as like we would look after heart health and muscle health and things like that. So, we're sort of not sort of embracing that sort of understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. And it's not just to be, wrapping people in cotton wool, or kids in cotton wool, or turning sport into or being a bit of a nanny state. There's a real concern around the family has to deal with it as well. If someone is starting to have these issues, no one thinks about the family, the wife or the partner or the kids or the parents have to suddenly understand what's going on. There's an economic health impact issue as well. There's a huge strain on the health economy around this. And even later on, we're starting to see a greater number of ex-footballer and rugby players in aged care facilities. So, there's all these other costs that we're not necessarily being made aware of, and we're just focusing in on, I'd do it all again. And, just ask the wife or a partner about that.
Yeah.
And they've got to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, exactly. So where to next, I guess? Is there any exciting or promising research happening at the moment? You mentioned the Boston study, but anything that that's coming up?
We've got it was talked about in the Four Corners program that we're still trying to work towards a clinical diagnostic criteria for CTE diagnosis in practice. That's sort of one of the major goals right now. We've got what they call a traumatic encephalopathy syndrome criteria for research use. So it's not a clinical criteria at this stage, but it's used for research purposes to help understand why some people may be getting CTE and others aren't, and comparing those that that meet the TES criteria versus those who've had a similar history but are not meeting it, and can we see differences in their brain scans or their physiology or their blood biomarkers or whatever, but we're hoping to progress that TES criteria that's being validated against pathology data in the brains towards being used in everyday practice, so that we can diagnose people with CTE just as we do diagnose people with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. So that's probably the main goal right now.
Well, before we wrap up, where else can people go to sort of check out some of your work or help to support or provide?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we certainly need financial support, and I sound like a grifter here, but we can't do this without funding to do this work, and so if people can have a look at the Australian Sports Brain Bank webpage, which is brainbank.org.au, but also we have the Concussion and CTE organisation. Concussion and CTE Foundation, and that looks at both concussion and CTE. So if you just Google Concussion and CTE Foundation Australia, that'll take you to their website. And then just, I guess, if anyone's interested in my research, I have what we call a ResearchGate page, which has all my publications and research. And, on a more, I guess, social media, I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Instagram, where I do rant a little bit. So if you want a bit of ranting, it's Alan Pearce, PhD.
Right. I think the work you're doing is amazing, Alan, and it's
Thank you.
it's long overdue in some ways, but obviously we need to do so much more in the future. But I think you're doing an amazing job, and hopefully just getting the word out there is a good starting point. So I really appreciate your time today.
No problems. Thanks for having me on.